So off the back of my interview as part of the Victoria Derbyshire show on the BBC Two last week, talking about my experiences with self-harm, which was in relation to the new statistics about the amount of teenage girls self-harming, which has increased dramatically. I just wanted to expand a little bit about self-harm and my experiences and my thoughts on that, really. So sorry, just to go back, my own experiences with self-harm started in my early teens myself, and I remember that the moment that I self-harmed, first of all, very clearly actually, and it was after quite a prolonged period of being depressed, which I didn't know at the time. I didn't know that's what it was. I didn't know what depression was. I didn't know what mental health was. I didn't know what any of it was, but I had been. And it had sort of come after a very long period of confusion, really, and just feeling angry and frustrated and very down, and it just kind of all accumulated into this moment, really, where I remember I literally could have ripped the house brick from brick, and that feeling when someone self-harms is it's an awful feeling. To anybody that's never self-harmed, or to anybody that is dealing with somebody that is self-harming, and to try and understand why they're doing it and how they're feeling, it's very difficult if you haven't been there, and it's also a very difficult thing to explain, really. And the only thing I can say is that it's quite an indescribable feeling, for me anyway. Obviously everybody will be different, but for me it was the immense emotions, immense frustration, literally not knowing what to do with those feelings, what to do with myself, what to do, just didn't know what to do. Just wanted to scream but couldn't, and that was where it started for me. And at that point, we're talking, I'm 32 now, I was my early teens, so we're talking a very long time ago. At that point, it wasn't in the media, there wasn't vlogging, there wasn't blogging, there wasn't Twitter, there wasn't Facebook, there wasn't the internet, until a bit further along, when we had the dong da da dong da dong dial-up. Hadn't seen it anywhere. It wasn't a replicated behaviour. It wasn't something that I was copying, that I'd seen on a soap. There was nothing. I remember going into the bathroom, and for me it was cutting, and I remember doing it, and I remember feeling like somehow all of those feelings and all of those overwhelming emotions were just somehow brought down slightly, and it was like my brain calmed a little, and I was just able to focus on something and take control of this absolutely overwhelming feeling of being out of control. And that's what it was for me. And I believe that's the situation for a lot of people that self-harm. It's a collision of a lot of emotions that people don't know what to do with. They don't know how to cope with them, and so it's a coping mechanism. Self-harm isn't classed as a mental illness in its own right, but it's often off the back of another mental illness, a mental health issue, or things that are going on in somebody's life that they can't deal with, bullying, family issues, whatever the case may be. It's off the back of overwhelming and distressing situations and feelings that somebody feels like they can't deal with. And I think it holds an awful lot of stigma, self-harm does. It really, really does. It's often thought about as an attention-seeking behaviour. This is something that really, really gets my goat. It is not attention-seeking. If it was attention-seeking, then people wouldn't go to the great lengths that they do to hide it. I went to ultimate lengths. It absolutely mortified me, the thought of somebody even finding out that I self-harmed. And when they did, I literally just wished that a great big hole would just literally come and swallow me up. It was the worst moment because it was mine. It was my coping mechanism, my way of coping. It was my secret. It was something that I absolutely didn't want to know anyone to know about, let alone, you know, draw attention from it. That was the absolute last thing I wanted. And so that is a really, really big stigma, and one that really, really needs to be abolished, because it is absolutely not the case. It's dealing with distressing, overwhelming emotions not to get attention. It's also not a suicide attempt in its own right. It may be somebody's way of expressing feeling suicidal, but mostly the act of self-harm itself isn't a suicide attempt, which is also another misconception, I think, about self-harm. And that's not the case. It may be expressing that that's how they're feeling, and if it's ignored, then that might be what somebody goes on to do, but the act of self-harm itself is usually not a suicide attempt. You know, it's one of these things that's greatly misunderstood, and there's so many reasons why people self-harm. You know, it's so complex, it's not straightforward. But one thing I will say, if there's anybody out there struggling with self-harm, I know how it feels. I know that moment. I know the feeling that goes behind that moment of self-harm, and it's awful. It really is. And it can also become quite an addictive behaviour. I found it took me many years, until sort of like into my 20s, to really start to get over it. And it feels like once you start doing it, you start doing it more and more to cope, and it becomes the go-to coping mechanism, because at the end of the day it works for people, and it's finding something else to replace that with, and that takes time. But one thing I will say to anybody struggling is that you can stop it. You know, it might not be immediate, and I think if you put a lot of pressure on yourself, no, I can't do this, sometimes that makes it worse. And I think that also is the case for parents, carers, teachers, whoever's dealing with somebody who's self-harming. It's quite easy and quite the go-to nature of it to say, stop it, don't do it. You know, you want it to go away. You don't want them to do that anymore, obviously. But sometimes putting pressure on not doing it actually runs the risk of pushing somebody away and alienating them, and having them not being open with you anymore. So it's quite a fine line and very difficult to deal with. What I will say is that it can be overcome. I overcame it. It took a long time, but it can be, and you can do it. And to anybody that's looking for advice, who's dealing with somebody who's self-harming, is not to tell them that it's wrong. Don't tell them that it's wrong. Don't say, you can't do that, you shouldn't do that, that's the wrong thing to do, what are you doing that for? Those are the worst things that you can say, because it makes the person feel even more guilty, more inferior, and it just kind of goads those feelings that are already there. It's about listening, and about kindness, and about finding why somebody's self-harming and the reasons behind somebody's self-harm, and dealing with those problems and seeking outside help for those problems, which would then reduce somebody's self-harming, and being able to find ulterior coping mechanisms. You know, shouting at children, shouting at teenagers, young people, adults, whoever it is, that they're silly, it's wrong, what are you doing that for, it's stupid. You know, I remember my moment when people found out, and just having a explosion of emotions from all over the place, and being asked why I was doing it. Was I trying to kill myself? Why would I try and kill myself? I was even told that if I wanted to kill myself, I was cutting the wrong way. Wrong way to go about it. Absolutely wrong way to go about it. It's just about being open, making the person feel like they can come to you, talk to you, open up to you, making them feel like, you know, they're okay, and it's okay, and you understand why they're doing this. Or if you don't understand why they're doing this, ask them to explain, and that you're here to listen. And it's just about making somebody feel safe, and like they've got someone to go to open up to, and trying to get to the reasons behind it, not just trying to make it go away or belittling it, because that's the worst things can be done, really. So yeah, it's very difficult, is self-harm, and I think it's important to get help from professionals. And you know, there's helplines, there's websites, there's forums, you know, if you're dealing with it on your own. But the thing is not to deal with it on your own. Self-harm lives in secrecy, and the secrecy actually adds to the self-harm, I found. And the secrecy eats away at you, which then makes the guilt worse, which then makes the self-harm worse, and it's a vicious cycle. So I'd say to anybody just to reach out, speak to somebody that you trust, or somebody neutral, like a helpline, like a Samaritan's, or there's the specific self-harm helplines out there. There's websites and things, just somebody that you feel like you can trust. But the initial step, and it's a very hard step, but it's a very brave step, and it's a very vital step, is to admit that you're self-harming, and to reach out and to talk to somebody about it. But you can beat it. It just takes that first step of actually reaching out to somebody and asking for help.